Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any bookish things that have gone on during the week or anything outside of the bookish world as well. This has been an interesting reading week. I finished one book. I had my first DNF of the year, and because of that, I am only partially through a different audiobook. We'll talk about all of those when we get to the Friday Reads portion of this video a little bit later. First, just a couple of things before we get in. The big bookish news that happened this week was that the International Booker Prize winner was announced. I have a reaction video that will be down below in the description box if you would like to check it out. I'm still really excited to check out more books from the long list and the short list for that, and we'll see how that goes. Stillborn, I believe, is being released later in the summer in the United States, and we'll all go from there. The big news that happened this week that I wanted to bring up really quickly is that Tina Turner, unfortunately, passed away. That hit me pretty hard. I knew it would when it eventually happened, but it really hit hard. She is one of my favorite celebrities, one of my favorite singers. It sounds a little bit trite, but she is someone who taught me that bad things can happen to you in the world and you don't have to let them own your life. You can move on and just be a happy person, and it doesn't have to define who you are. And I was really young when details of her personal life and her relationship with Ike Turner came out. I was young when the movie What's Love Got to Do With It came out. So maybe it's just that it was in that wheelhouse where I was learning that the world is a complicated place. But she definitely taught me that, and that for that reason, she is one of my favorite, most impactful celebrities. So that was a sad loss for me. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to talk about today, before we move into the Friday Reads portion of the video, is last weekend and what Joel and I got up to. I talked about it very briefly in my book haul video for the month of May. That will be linked down below as well. I bought too many books in the month of May. Actually, I love all of them, so I can't really say that. But I hinted at what we had done because I purchased books at bookstores in Bozeman. So last weekend, wow, it's been the end of a long week. Can you tell? Last weekend, Joel and I went to Bozeman, Montana, because it was Pride in Bozeman. Different cities in Montana have Pride on different weekends. They sort of stagger them out. Our favorite is the one in Helena, which is always in July. But anyway, Bozeman had their Pride, and two bookstores in the area, Country Bookshelf in Bozeman and Wheatgrass Books in Livingston, which is just outside of Bozeman, both decided to do drag story hours. Drag story hours have been vilified by conservatives in this country who are using it as a sort of culture war thing, and in a war against transgender people and LGBTQ plus rights. And it's terrifying in particular because it is also a way of vilifying LGBTQ plus people and trying to make it seem as if we are scary, dangerous people who should not be allowed around children. So there are much larger implications for things like drag story hour bans that I think are reprehensible. As such, you can imagine I wanted to support these story hours, and so did Joel. So we made it a point to be in the area so we could show up and support them. I wore this t-shirt that I'm wearing right now, Protect Trans Kids, and then it has the Montana Book Company logo underneath. And, you know, I kind of expected that there would be protesters at these events. There was a group of protesters at Montana Book Company's Drag Story Hour last year. But these were a little scarier. So when we showed up at Wheatgrass, as Joel and I were looking for a parking space, we saw people wearing masks and carrying white supremacist signs, like White Lives Matter, and just horrible signs marching down the street. So we parked and went to the store anyway. We figured that is where they were heading, and sure enough, they marched around the corner and approached the store. Thankfully, there was a police presence outside, and it just so happens that directly next to Wheatgrass Books, there is an alley, and it formed a sort of natural barrier between them and us. and the police made sure people didn't really cross. So there was at least separation there. That turned out not to be the case in Bozeman later. I can tell you now from experience that it is alarming to see white supremacists wearing masks, angrily marching down a street in your direction with a bullhorn, shouting horrible things that don't even bear repeating. The one thing that was truly bizarre, they just kept saying, "You are a pedophile, you are a pedophile," and then they would ask questions like, "Does your mother like pedophiles?" And it's like, no, of course my mother doesn't like pedophiles, but nobody here is a pedophile. So anyway, things like that. I can say now from experience that it is really alarming to see that. I think more than anything else, they were probably trying to bait people from our side into getting angry and lashing out at them. There were some people who took the bait enough to yell and insult the protesters back, but nobody resorted to violence. I think that's probably what they were going for. All of them had, like, what the main guy had a body cam strapped to his chest like a leather harness, oddly enough. But anyway, so there were about 20 of them. There were, I think, more people outside the store. And the unfortunate thing is, obviously this also rattled the people who work at Wheatgrass. And in particular, I think the cashier from the store was really shaken up about it. Joel and I went inside after the protesters left to make a purchase, but also just to kind of check in. And unfortunately, she was very rattled. So I'm glad we had a chance to kind of talk to her. I'm glad we were there to support them. But, it's disheartening because, if you are someone who owns a bookstore and you see things like this happen, part of what they want is that you will be scared to do that again. And that it's something that happens. It works pretty effectively. Again, it is really alarming to see these people storming up the street toward you. So I don't blame anybody who works at a bookstore or a library or anything if they are intimidated by this. It's really unfortunate. So they arrived not long before the drag story hour was supposed to start. They demonstrated for about 30 minutes and then they left. There were people across the street from the event who were not wearing masks. Clearly they were people who were local to Livingston, Montana, which is the town where Wheatgrass Books is. And someone who worked at the store did confirm that those were locals in the town, one of whom was a preacher, who clearly weren't there to support the event, but also kind of wanted that plausible deniability of not being on the side of the street where the white supremacists were. However, the white supremacists would periodically, some of them would break off and go across the street and would chat and laugh with the people across the street and hand out pamphlets, clearly sort of recruiting material, which is scary. Some people who were at the event said that this group of people was not even from Montana, that they are from Idaho, which makes sense. Idaho, unfortunately, has a weird number of militia groups and things like that. So does Montana. So does Wyoming. And I live in Montana, so you can imagine that's fun for me. But anyway, I don't know how they knew that. I don't know if it's true, but that was one of the weird things, is that the leader in particular was pointing at people and saying, "We don't want you in Montana." And it's like, you aren't even from here. So, but there were locals who clearly weren't there to support the event. And hopefully we're not radicalized by the presence of these people and the literature that they gave out, because these are scary, scary times. So after about 30 minutes from when the event started, they left. Now, Wheatgrass's drag story hour was at 11. In Bozeman, which is about a 30-minute drive from Livingston, Country Bookshelf was having a drag story hour at 1. So when the white supremacists left at about approaching noon, I think. Clearly, they were leaving so they could go to Bozeman, and that is exactly what they did. By the time Joel and I got there, they were already there protesting outside the store. But so the other unfortunate thing about this is that Wheatgrass was having the event outside the store. They were having kids draw with chalk on the sidewalk. They were doing face painting, and that was taking place outside. So when these people stormed up to the store, children saw it and were scared and confused, and parents quickly got them inside to where the event was going to be on the second floor of the store. But that's really sad as well, that these kids had to be scared and confused. And if there are kids in that situation who will grow up to be LGBTQIA, I mean, obviously they would be now, but they will grow up to be able to identify that way. Maybe it'll be that much harder for them to accept who they are. And I like to think we would live in a world where that would not be the case. We should be getting better, not getting worse or staying the same. And that hurts. That hurts a lot. But so after they left, Joel and I went inside to the store. We bought a bunch of greeting cards because they had really, really great greeting cards. And I bought one book from them. And that is in the book haul if you'd like to check that out. It will be linked down below. So once we made the purchase and had a long talk with the cashier, hopefully helped calm her down. She really seemed very rattled. I felt very bad. We hopped in the car and went to Bozeman. We did stop for lunch on the way because we were hungry. By the time we got to Bozeman and parked, and Bozeman is where Pride actually was. Bozeman is a large city. It is. I thought it was larger than it is. But Bozeman has grown very significantly in the 10 years that Joel and I have lived in Montana. It is, like Missoula, a university town, but it is better situated. It's near Yellowstone, so it gets a lot of tourism. It is also situated in the mountains, so it has better skiing than Missoula does. So it's a place that is growing really quickly. The only reason I mentioned that is because that is where the Pride was. Obviously, there were more people there. The town itself was more crowded. By the time we parked and got to Country Bookshelf, the white supremacists were already there. There was no police presence to speak of in Bozeman, which is surprising. The closest police officer was 30 to 40 feet away from the store. And one of the drag queens had approached them and was trying to show them video on their phone of some altercation had happened before we got there, and allegedly someone was hurt. I didn't see it. I don't know what happened. But apparently that happened. And the police were not front and center at the store the way they were at Wheatgrass, and there was no natural barrier like that alley outside Wheatgrass Books. So protesters and counter-protesters were shoulder to shoulder in front of the store. And that was also scary, because you had a wall of people standing at the edge of the store to keep them from walking onto the sidewalk in front of the store. And the white supremacists were just leaning between their shoulders to yell at people. So that was scary as well. There was also a little bit more confusion about what was going on. We were told that we couldn't stay on the sidewalk, so we either had to go into the store or disperse. So we went into Country Bookshelf, and it became clear that the white supremacists weren't going to leave. I like to think that they would have been told the same thing we were, but they weren't going anywhere. Thankfully, the line of people standing in front of them hadn't moved either. So Joel and I just went back outside to maintain presence out there. But a lot of people had left or gone into the store. So anyway, and then eventually the white supremacists dispersed again, and they kind of marched. They went down to the corner, crossed the street, and then marched in the other direction with their signs. And I guess they were just going to do their own little mini parade down the street. Thankfully, the people of Bozeman were not having it and just laughed at them. There was not as much of, like, there weren't really people for them to cater to along the sidelines like there had been in Livingston. They didn't get to hand out any literature, I don't think. So Joel and I went inside and we got to see the end of the drag story hour. And very similar to the drag story hour that I saw in Helena last year at Montana Book Company, the drag queens were telling stories and reading books about self-acceptance and the importance of being part of your community and helping other people. So, you know, when they protest these events, they are protesting messages of self-acceptance, self-love, and the importance of being part of your community. That's what they're protesting. Just because the message comes from someone in drag. It hurts my head. It hurts my heart. You know, it's a beautiful and important message for kids to learn, and shouldn't be protested. I think that goes without saying. So, to wrap up that story, the story time ended, and Joel and I shopped in the store. If you're ever in Bozeman, definitely take a trip to Wheatgrass. It's a beautiful store, Wheatgrass. It has a great fiction section. They have a really great selection of greeting cards and things. I'll put a link to their website in the description box down below as well. If you have the means and are looking for an independent bookstore to order from and support, I would definitely point you toward them as well. You know, again, this is a store in a small town that did a really cool thing. And it's a nice store as well. So consider them. Country Bookshelf is in Bozeman, and they are a really great store. They're a large store as well. They have a very long fiction section and a really great one. So I purchased some books from them as well, and I purchased a t-shirt that I was going to wear for my Friday Reads video, but I purchased the wrong size. So I'm going to have to exchange it for a different one. It's fine. I figured I would just wear the t-shirt that I wore on that day instead. And I'll put the link to Country Bookshelf's website down below as well. If you'd again, if you're looking for bookstores to support, Wheatgrass and Country Bookshelf are great ones. Who did a very cool thing. So think about that. And then the final part of this story is that one of the drag queens took a quick video of the protesters and the counter-protesters outside the store and shared that to social media. I saw it because Chelsea from Montana Book Company saw it and sent it to me on Instagram. And that night, Joel's best friend, who lives in Seattle, texted us because Rachel Maddow had taken that footage from social media and used it in her show. And you can see Joel and I in the crowd. So in a way, Joel and I were on Rachel Maddow. That's kind of cool. I'll put a photo of it right there. It's not a great angle. It was really quick, but it's Joel and it's me. I think it caught me doing a quick scan of how many people were there, because this was after people had been told to disperse. So I was checking to see how many of us had remained compared to the white supremacists, and there were still more of us, thankfully. So I think I got caught in the middle of doing that, but it's okay. And just, you know, that's a kind of cool thing that somebody else sent it to Joel as well. I think I sent it to more people. Just be like, oh my God, look what happened. But Joel knows 2 or 3 people who saw it, recognized us, and sent it to him. So that was funny. Anyway, I guess this is also important to talk about because we are heading into Pride Month. And I really want to stress the importance of supporting Pride, for one thing, but also if your town or community is doing a drag story hour, please consider showing up. You know, groups like the people who showed up in Livingston and in Bozeman want you to be scared, and they want communities to be afraid of events like this. So not only will people be unwilling to host prides, but people will be unwilling to show up. So it's more important than ever to get out there, support your local pride events in whatever way you can, and stand up as part of your community. So as we head into Pride, I hope that will happen more, that people will continue to show up and we can work toward making progress to getting rid of groups like this. That is my hope. Because, again, I know I grew up, I was already a teenager when Ellen came out on her sitcom. And not long after that, Will and Grace hit the air, and things started to change rapidly over the next 10 years after that. But I was already a teenager. So I grew up in a time when it was rare to see depictions of gay people. It was rare to see it in the media or anything like that. So then there was a deep sense of shame attached to it. And I am of the time period where I grew up with that shame and that sense of hiding away. But I was young enough to I guess, pivot into the world where it started to be more acceptable. And now it feels like we're going backwards. And I loved the idea that the generation after me, or people born even 10 years after me, were not going to grow up with that sense of shame. And I hate to think that it would exist now. So we need to do what we can to make sure that it doesn't happen now. And I'll get off my soapbox. Sorry, I'm a little emotional about it still. Again, it's alarming to see a group like that marching toward you. It is disappointing that it is so tough out there for events like that, and that the political climate has gotten so scary for people who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community. And I hope that we can make it better for all of us. So let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of the story, and this video. And so, as I said, I finished one book, and I had my first DNF of the year. I almost considered continuing with the book just so I wouldn't have a DNF, but I decided to let it go. So that book, let's talk about it first, is Wanderers by Chuck Wendig. Now, there is a bit of an interesting discussion to be had alongside this, because it's not that Wanderers is badly written. It's not that there's necessarily anything wrong with the book itself. This became a DNF largely, you know what I'm saying? Largely because of the length of the book. And I've seen a lot of discussion about long books in comments on my videos and whether or not people read them. And particularly, it has been a source of conversation in the comments on a video that I did recently about 15 books I'll probably never read. I'll link that down below as well. Because part of the reasoning for some of those books is that, in part, they're long. And so I've gotten a bunch of comments on that video where people will say, you shouldn't really be worried about reading a long book. Reading a long book is kind of like reading 3 books, except you only finish 1 instead of 3. I hear that. I agree. I am a proponent of reading long books. I am not opposed to reading long books. The problem with some of those is, like, say, Ulysses is a long book that is famous for being difficult. So it's not the length of the book that's the only reason I don't want to read it. It's the fact that it's a long book that is also difficult. And to use a weird example that might not work, consider if you have a very strict financial budget. You can purchase one really expensive item that you might not even like, or you can purchase 3 or 4 things. I sometimes would rather purchase the 3 or 4 things. Not all the time, but sometimes. So, the reason I use that as an example is money is a resource. So is your time. So is your mental capacity. You are able to spend those in the ways that you would like. So if you are someone who doesn't like long books, that's fine. I don't agree. I like a long book. But I also think a long book needs to justify its length for you. It needs to give you a reason to spend your time, which is a resource, and your mental capacity, which is a resource. So the reason Ulysses is a book that I will probably never read is it wants a lot of my time and it wants a lot of my mental capacity. The reason I am probably never going to get to Moby Dick is because it wants a lot of my time, which is a resource, and it has a reputation for being boring. So do I want to give it so much of my time? That's the question. It's not the length. It's that these long books sometimes need to give you something back. So, Wanderers. I was 3 hours in, and I had been working my way through it very slowly. And what I was starting to realize come Wednesday was I wasn't into it. I wasn't interested enough to really spend time listening to it. And I got this from Libby, which operates on the library. So I only had 2 weeks, and it was a hold list. I was on the hold list for about a month for this. And I wasn't interested, to the point where, given the choice between listening to Wanderers or listening to a podcast, I chose a podcast. And that's not good when it's a library book and you're on a time crunch. So that was already not good. And I was like, but there's nothing wrong with the story per se, except that there are two storylines. And one of them, with this guy named Benji, is feeling very info dumpy. He is spending a lot of time talking about science. He's talking about AI. He's talking about disease transmission. He's talking about pandemics and how the CDC responds to them. This book was published in 2019, I should add, and unfortunately became timely come 2020 for obvious reasons. But, I'm very familiar with disease transmission at this point. I'm familiar with pandemics and how the CDC responds to them. So I didn't need 3 hours of having that kind of explained to me. So Charlie from Montana Book Company had actually recommended this to me, and I texted them and said, so I'm 3 hours in. There are 30 hours left. I just really don't feel invested. Is it worth hanging in for the next 30 hours? And Charlie obviously said, well, I think it is. And they said, here's the thing. Chuck Wendig is the master of a slow burn. He will take a lot of time giving you information and then setting things up, and then all of a sudden really kind of messed up stuff will start happening and the book starts progressing. You just have to work to get to that point. And here's my thing, and the reason I was talking about the challenge of a long book. If I'm 3 hours in and I don't feel invested, that's not good. If I have 30 hours left and it's going to take like 8 hours to get to the point where stuff really starts to happen and get interesting, that's too much for me. So I put this down. And again, that's not a judgment. It's a well-written book. I can tell it's very clever. But where I'm at right now, I'm not willing to spend my time, which is a resource, on a book I'm not invested in. So, and again, the reason I'm talking about it in terms of being a long book is, if this was a 9-hour audio or a 12-hour audio and I was 3 hours in and not feeling invested, I probably would have finished. I'd say, let's just keep going. But 30 hours didn't happen. So, yeah, and the same is true of a short book. A short book has a very different challenge and structure. If you're going to write a novella, you need to quickly introduce characters, setting, and stakes, and do something interesting and powerful with them. Right here, small things like these, I think, is a perfect example of a book that achieves that. But you have to manage those in a very condensed format. If you are going to do a longer book, you need to introduce those things and get the interest and then sustain it over a much longer period of time. And I try to think about that when I create videos as well. I like to keep my videos under 30 minutes. As I say this, I'm about to go over 30 minutes. But by and large, I try to keep in mind, if I'm going to go over 30 minutes, I need to try to make sure that the information I'm keeping in the video is interesting and that people are going to care. Do I always succeed? Probably not. But I always try to think about it. Like, if you are going to spend the time on a video that's more than 30 minutes, you deserve to be entertained or at least getting something informative. So it's on me to try to do that. And the other thing is, I looked at the page on Wikipedia for Wanderers, and 3 hours into the book, I hadn't even been introduced to several major storylines, some of which sounded interesting. So one of them sounds like it really depends on the pandemic part of the story getting a little further along before it gets introduced. But again, if I'm 3 hours into a book and I've only been introduced to 2 out of 5 or 6 storylines, that's not great either. And I don't want a 33-hour audiobook that is short chapters, each one set up with a cliffhanger. Like, I don't want the James Patterson book structure to get me through it, but I feel like I need a better balance. I need some more stakes faster, and I need to get to the action. I don't want info dump for 3 hours, and apparently it's going to be longer. The info dump will keep going for a while based on the point where I stop. That's me. Your mileage may vary. I've heard really great things about Chuck Wendig. Again, Charlie from Montana Book Company is a huge Chuck Wendig fan. Huge. And he seems like a cool guy. So, and again, the writing is really clever and sharp. It does, with a shorter book, I could have easily been pulled through. It's just the fact that I was feeling not invested 3 hours in and had 30 hours left that made me bail. So, I let it go. Let's talk about the book I did finish. So I was talking, I think last week, about how I'm supposed to be picking up A Room with a View, and we're here at the end of May and I haven't done it yet. But Joel finished Arthur and Teddy Are Coming Out by Ryan Love and really loved it. So I decided to make this my next book instead of holding it for Pride Month. I will be doing my Pride Month Pile of Possibilities soon, hopefully. And this was originally on it, but I decided to read it now because Joel had loved it so much, and I think A Room with a View is going to be my next book. So I read this. The premise of the book is exactly the title. It begins with Arthur, who is about to turn 80. He has been married for a long time and has grandchildren and all of that. He decides to come out of the closet. And the setup is a little more complicated. This is not a spoiler because it's all right there in the first chapter of the book. He is actually still living with his wife. She knew that he was gay. Basically, they both kind of helped each other out. And I won't get into what situation he needed out of and what she needed out of, but basically she knew that he was gay when they got married. And for various reasons, to get out of bad situations, they decided to marry each other. And ended up, like, they were very good friends. There is definitely love there. It's more of like a friendship love, but there is incredible love between them. So they ended up enjoying each other's company, and they felt safe and comfortable with each other. So they had children, they stayed together, and now all these years later, he has been thinking about his age and how much time he has left, and has decided that he wants to have some time to be his authentic self. For however long he has left. So he comes out of the closet. I pointed at the wrong one. He comes out of the closet. His grandson, Teddy, this one, is also gay and has been kind of struggling with the idea of coming out. And one of the things that was particularly interesting to me about this book is that Teddy sees the way certain family members, specifically his mother, react negatively or have a difficult time reconciling Arthur coming out. And that makes it more difficult for Teddy to come out. Now, I have a gay father. And he came out when I was 11 years old, which was about a year after my parents separated and divorced. And not everyone in my family reacted well. My mother had a very harsh reaction, mostly for personal. She felt that she had been maligned. I totally understand. But because I saw the way other people reacted to my father coming out, it made it more difficult for me to accept myself because I didn't think that they would accept me if they knew. So people often assume that because I have a gay father, it must have been easy for me to come out. And certainly there are ways in which it was easier, but there are also ways in which it was more difficult. And this book captures some of the ways in which it was more difficult. Ultimately, it ended up being easier because by the time I did come out, and in my case, it was years later, not months, like Teddy, my father had paved the way for me. And the family members who had had a negative reaction to it had had time to reconcile their thinking and come around to maybe a better understanding of things. So that's the setup of the book. And I think the setup is kind of the best part of the book, being honest. This was recommended based on how much Joel and I loved the Albert Entwistle book by Matt Cain, and how then we loved Becoming Ted, which I think I read this month even as well, and Joel read this month, and I just loved. And there is definitely a lot of the same vibe. My quibble with this book is that this is a debut novel, and to me, it definitely feels like a debut novel. Joel, I think, and we'll talk about this in our monthly wrap-up, he kind of sprinted through it and was able to appreciate it for what it is. I would get stuck on a lot of the definite, like, flashing lights of, like, debut novel. Some of the plotting is a little clumsy. And when I say that, so for instance, Teddy is sitting at a table at one point with certain members of the family. He gets a phone call and answers it and starts talking about the family. So I remember reading that thinking, did I miss something? And like flipping back, it's like, did he walk away from the table? It doesn't say he did. He must have, because why would he talk about his family in front of his family? And there are little things like that. And there's another instance where they're in a limo. Now, the book kind of goes out of its way to say that this is not a stretch limo. It's like a normal-sized limo. However, there are too many people to fit comfortably in a normal-sized limo. They would kind of have to have some form of stretch limo in order for them all to fit. But anyway, Teddy starts out sitting with his boyfriend on one side of the limo, and then he moves over to the other side to sit between his best friend and Arthur. And then, all of a sudden, his boyfriend is sitting next to him. And again, I remember I was like flipping back, like, did he move over? How did he get next to them? And then Ben starts complaining about Teddy's best friend. It's like, but his best friend is sitting next to him. He can hear you. So there are just like little things like that that really stood out to me. And I will say, I think I can't get into it too much without spoiling the book, so I won't. I don't think the character of Teddy makes sense. He's a very flawed, like 22-year-old person who's trying to figure out his life. But there are areas in which he has blinders and has a bit of privilege that he's kind of coasting on, and the ways in which he doesn't make sense that if you apply logic to them, you can kind of rationalize away, but the book isn't helping reconcile them at all. So I had a bit of a problem with that. It's a very cute book. Honestly, part of the appeal is that it's a grandfather and a grandson both coming out of the closet and coming to terms with themselves. However, I like Arthur's part of the book much better than the Teddy portion of the book. Joel loved it. He'll tell you all about it in our monthly wrap-up. But I had some quibbles that I'm not sure I could entirely get past. So I liked this book, but I was kind of, in the end, incapable of loving it. However, I think Ryan Love does show potential to be someone like a Matt Cain. And Matt Cain is not Toni Morrison. It's not that kind of literature. But he's really good at this kind of heartwarming story that has a lot of like serious elements in it and can be inspiring. Ryan Love has the potential to be that. I think it's going to take another book or two before he gets there. But there's promise. There's a lot of promise. So, I would recommend this again. Joel loved it. But I like it. I don't love it, being honest. Once I finally put Wanderers down, it took me so long to decide to kind of have a reconcile. I had to have like a come to Jesus moment about Wanderers and what I was doing with it on Wednesday. So yesterday, as I'm filming this, I started a new book, but I didn't get very far into it. That's Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. I decided to do it now because there's enough time for me to finish it before we get into June, when I will be focusing on LGBTQ plus books. And before the Women's Prize is announced, I figured it would be a good time to read it. So I'm doing it. I'm only about 17% into the audio, so there's a ways to go. But I'm really liking it so far. People had described this book as boring to me in comments about the Women's Prize and how it made it onto the shortlist and in regard to its chances of winning. A lot of people refer to it as boring. I don't find it boring. I think it's really beautifully written. I think it is engaging and moving forward. Like, I've actually been thinking, like, oh, I want to listen to that today, which I can't say about Wanderers. So it's definitely engaged me just in the first 17%. I think what people are potentially reacting to is that it's about the Troubles, and there are a fair amount of books and novels specifically that deal with that topic. So maybe people are a little tired of that, or maybe people are wanting it to do something a little more. I'm enjoying it. I'm liking it a lot so far. We'll see how that goes. But I'm liking it. I'm liking it a good deal so far. So I'm probably going to do A Room with a View next. And then I'll start pivoting into my Pride Month reading. And then when I finish Trespasses, I'm probably also going to start pivoting into Pride Month reading, which is going to be exciting. I also believe I have finished working on the written portion of my Pulitzer Prize deep dive on the Grapes of Wrath. So I'm hoping that today I will be able to film the video. If I can, you'll have it on Monday. No promises, but it's coming. It will definitely be coming. If not on Monday, it will be coming. Hopefully Monday. We'll see. I think that covers everything. If you have comments, suggestions, recommendations, anything that you would like to say, let me know in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.